Hi, and welcome back to Bike Speeds. This week we're going to service this Canyon Endurace. This one needed wheel bearings, a chain, some detailing, good cleanup, a good lubrication, and there was actually quite a lot on this bike that was actually loose. So this service was really needed on this bike and really sort out these little tiny details that will make the world of difference to this bike in terms of its longevity between servicing. So you can see here, quite grimy, and we had a lot of play in this rear wheel. There was quite a knocking noise there, left to right. I could feel there was movement in that wheel. It was noisy when it spun. So clearly with this one, it had bearing issues. So we're going to resolve those as we do the service. We'll get that all apart and get those bearings changed. You can see here, chain 0.75. That's absolutely the sweet spot for changing the chain. It wasn't stretched to 1%, but it was certainly stretched out. That needs changing. So we shall get that off and get that replaced. Any more of that stretch on there and it would have been wearing the rest of the components on that drivetrain. So he caught that just in the nick of time. So I was quite pleased with that alone. So off come the wheels now. We're going to take the cassette off. This actually was quite loose. It wasn't very tight at all on there. Certainly wasn't at the correct torque setting. We were able to get that nut off there, but we had a little bit of a job getting the actual cogs off of the hub. Had to use a screwdriver to break them off and free them off. Again, that's because the hub itself was dry. We're going to lubricate that before we put this back on, and it just helps with taking it on and off. You can see there quite a bit of grime built up on that cassette. I love these 105 cassettes. They clean up really nicely because they're like a chromed steel rather than titanium in any way, and they always clean up nice. It's always a pleasure to do a 105 cassette. Going to get the rear derailleur off. That comes off now. You can see built up grime and debris. Quite dry this as well. The whole bike had a very dry, powdery dirt over it, so very important to get it cleaned and lubricated. Off comes the front derailleur. The cables themselves on this bike were okay. It was changing gear nicely. No need to do those. We don't want to add expense to our customer's bill, so we will reuse all the cables on this bike. You can see there, front derailleur, very dry, clearly needs lubricating, clearly needs cleaning up, so we'll make sure that we get that spot on as well. We're going to take the chain set off to check the bottom bracket and also to clean that chain set up. You'll see this was very dirty on the back, so we get that arm off. We needed to tap this out. Sometimes they slide out, and they should really if they've been lubricated. That was very dry to get it out of the bearing, so that comes off, and you can see there the dusty dry dirt that's on the back of this. If you was to then lubricate the bike, that dirt that's on these components would soak up that lubricant and it wouldn't really get where it needed to be anyway. So it's important to clean those off before we actually even lubricate these components. So we're going to take all these components off and clean them up before we lubricate them and before we put them back on the bike. So off comes the rear brake there, then the front brake. Again, although these cable tails on the cables were very short, there was no need to replace them. Everything was working correctly. So we'll just get those brakes off, leave the cables on the bike. So that comes off the front forks there. We're almost back to the frame where we need to be, but you can see there with this brake just how much dirt, dry dirt has built up on that brake there. That's the rear brake. It's very common for those to seize when they get that kind of dirt build up. So again, a very timely service to keep this bike running smoothly moving forwards. We did take these chain rings off and take this apart because it was so grimy. It just made our job cleaning it a little bit easier. And also with the derailleur itself, we get the jockey wheels out. These have bearings in them, so we didn't want to put those through the ultrasonic cleaner. We'll just clean those up on the bench before we put them back into the derailleur. Now we can pick out which bits we're going to ultrasonic clean, which bits we're just going to wash down. They go in the ultrasonic cleaner, and we'll get those buzzing away, and while they're running we'll clean a few other bits up, make sure that everything's nice, and then once they've been through we wash them down with warm soapy water. Everything we wash down, so we've got the derailleurs and the brakes, all the components that we've took off the bike, the chain set and everything. Wash all those down, dry them all off, blow them out with an airline, microfiber towel to dry them off before we start the lubricating process. So again, that cassette, it comes up so lovely. These 105 cassettes, they are my favourite cassette to clean because they've got that lovely chrome into them. You don't get a lot of chrome components on modern bikes, but you do get a nice chrome cassette. So I do clean that up and I do enjoy that. Chain rings, they're just washed down. I didn't put those through the ultrasonic cleaner. That was a very dry, muddy dirt on there, so very easy to clean up, and the teeth themselves were relatively clean, so that's no problem. Next up, we're going to get the derailleur back together. So in go the jockey wheels. We've put a little bit of Loctite on the pivot points for the jockey wheels. They now all go back together. And now we're going to use our grease selection to lubricate these components up. So on that thumb adjuster, that's very important to lubricate. So a little bit of general purpose where the thumb adjuster goes, a little bit of copper grease on the threaded area before that threads into the derailleur. You can see there we do a syringe set of 5 syringes. This is actually our own product, and you do support the channel by buying these off our website, so please do check that out. We'll put the link in the description below. You can see I'm just using our general purpose oil on the pivot points of the derailleur. They're actually a non-lubricated part, but as parts wear, it's always good to give that little bit of lubrication to stop any corrosion forming in those pivot points and keep it running nicely through its lifespan. Also, the front brake, general purpose oil on the pivot points and on the quick release. A little bit of premium grease on the spring to stop that corroding. We also did that with the derailleurs. And then we're just using our copper grease on the threads of the chain set bolts themselves. They're stainless steel, stop them corroding against this chain set. And also use our general purpose grease on the spider itself where the cogs meet that, because they're very prone to bonding in. And if I'm going to service this bike again, I want to make my job easy next time, so we can then start to put that together, and I know that everything will come apart again next time nicely, so that we can get it all serviced again in the future. And go the bolts. I torque these up on the bench, that way I know that everything is in its final set position when it goes back on the bike. Front derailleur obviously shifts left and right, so it's important that those parts are tight and correct. Now I'm going to work on this wheel. Quite a big job this in itself, takes quite a lot of time, very time consuming. Initially I'm going to start getting it apart. There's various different ways these wheels come apart, various different ways this hub will come off of the axle itself. We just work our way through, tap out the first bearing using the axle itself. You notice I didn't hit against the axle, I put in a fit in there to stop it being damaged, and then I'm going to actually extract the bearing out of the other side. I try and avoid hammering all bearings out. The first one often on wheels and the first one in the hub itself you often have to knock out, but the others you can extract. So I've extracted that out. Now I'm going to clean everything up. With bearings and the way they seat in a wheel, everything has to be clean before you put it back together. You can't just pull them out and put them in. You'll ruin the hub itself, so make sure everything is clean, which is what I'm doing there. I use a little bit of degreaser, make sure those little paw grippers are all correct. Clean down the axles themselves. Microfiber towel is a great way of cleaning those off. And now I'm going to also wash the wheel. This is a lovely carbon wheel. It's got those nice bladed spokes. I'm going to wash all that down just to make sure that everything's okay there. And again, to make sure the wheel is spotlessly clean before I do that axle work of putting the bearings back in. That's coming up rather nicely. Quite happy there now. A little bit of our premium grease on the seats where the bearings sit. That will help that bearing slide in there. And then I'm also going to use our free hub grease, again available on our website, where the paws will sit inside that cog there, and then I can just pop those in, pop in the press, and I won't have to worry about greasing that once everything's back in and the axle's in. It just made my job a little bit easier to do that as a first. So in goes that first side bearing, put a nice high quality bearing in there. Now I can premium grease the axle itself, again to help that seat inside the bearings, to help everything smoothly glide into its place. It will push that grease out where it doesn't need it, but it will help those bearings go in. So again, I'm going to press this in, I'm not going to hammer it in. We've had to use a slightly smaller shaft, sort of our own creation of press here, but we're using the fittings that come with our other press, but it just wouldn't quite sit through that axle, so we've pressed that in nicely. Now I'm going to take the free hub apart again. First bearing needs a knockout, that comes out okay. The second bearing I will extract, I won't hammer it out. The extractor also pulls these things in and out very square. You're not going to damage the hub or the wheel if you extract out as many bearings as you can without knocking them out. So quite happy with that now. Pop that through the ultrasonic cleaner as well. Doesn't do any harm to get that nice in-depth clean like we do on all the other components. Wash that down, dry it off, make sure everything's spotless, and then we can start putting the new bearings in. So again, same principle, using a little bit of our premium grease to seat the bearings to help them go in, using our press to get them in. We're not hammering them in. Everything nice and smooth, nice and correct. Then we know that it will be absolutely spot on when it goes back on the wheel. So in goes the first set. There is a little retainer clip in here, so I just pop that in before I put the second bearing in. Again, a little bit of our premium grease straight out of our syringe selection there. Pop that in, and again we can press everything in. So there's a little spacer between those two bearings which I've popped in there. In goes our press. Get everything correct, and we can just spin that in. Quite easy process once everything's set up. So that's the hub all sorted and ready to go back on. Now this is silicone grease. It's great for rubbers. This has a little rubber O-ring that's around the edge of that. It's a little seal to make sure it's sealed against the elements. They can squeak, so a little bit of silicone grease on there will help that seat and run smoothly in the wheel. We don't use the silicone grease on every job, but it's useful when you need it. So now we're using the free hub grease to put the pawls back into the hub. So there's the little springs. All this has been cleaned up and is spotless. So we know that everything there is perfect. It's as new, nicely lubricated, fresh bearings. And we can just put a little bit of our free hub grease around there so that when it seats into the wheel, which we've already put a little bit of free hub grease in, you don't need to overdo it on these. Just a nice little brush on there, and in that pops, and everything is absolutely spot on. I can put the end caps back on now, and I now know that that wheel is ready to do thousands of miles and will be absolutely fine. I'm also just going to put a little bit of general purpose grease on the hub itself to help those cogs for the cassette slide on there nicely, and that will also enable them to slide off again, so hopefully they should come off nice and easily next time. On goes the lock nut. We do torque that up. It wasn't at the right torque originally, but now it is. And now the final thing for me to do for this wheel is line up the logo with the valve on the wheel and tyre. Just looks perfect when you present the bike. It's the way it should be. Also helps you identify punctures and where they are. It's just good practice to get that logo lined up and smooth. I would say 80% of the services I do, I have to either turn the tyre around because it's rotating in the wrong direction, or rotate the tyre to line up the logos. There's never a bike, or it seems there's never a bike goes by where I don't have to do something like this during a service. It doesn't actually take long. I get well used to changing tyres and turning them around and lining logos up and things, but it's just good practice on my part to make sure that that also presents where it should be on the bike. So inflate that, pop on a valve cap. Often they get broken, but we replace those if they are, and now I can wash the bike down. Now this bike was in for a routine service. It wasn't a detailing service, it's just a very routine entry-level service for us. So we wash the frame down, make sure that everything is clean. I'm using our big softy brush there, this lovely nylon brush that we also sell on the website. We use this day in, day out. They last so well, and they're nice and soft. They don't scratch the frame, and they're perfect for this kind of quick wash down on a bike. Concentrating a little bit on that bottom bracket area there. You saw how dirty that was, so I really worked that in with the brush, both sides, to make sure that was nice and clean. And we also just wash down the saddle to make sure that everything is nice and clean for the customer when they get back on the bike. And now I'm going to use a microfiber towel to dry down and wipe that off. Make sure that it's all nice and clean. You can get in all the nooks and crannies with a microfiber towel just to really finish that cleaning job off. And now we can start putting the bike back together. Using a little bit of our premium grease on the crankset itself, that will help it slide into this bearing. We checked the bearing, everything there felt good, it felt okay, it didn't feel like it needed any work or a new bearing, so that goes in nicely. We will pre-tension the bearing there, and then we will also tighten up this pedal arm and torque it at the same time. We don't do that separately like we do when we run through the bike at the end. Again, because it's the bottom bracket area, I want that left and right to be in its final position before I adjust the front derailleur. On go the pedals. We actually grease the threads where they sit into the pedal arms. They're very prone to seizing in, so we make sure that they're greased with a little bit of our copper grease, and then also pop on the front derailleur. The tails on these cables were very, very short, but they were long enough to do this job without replacing them, which saves the customer a little bit of money. The gear shifting was perfect, so there was no need to replace those. and increase the bill unnecessarily. So in goes the rear derailleur there. We're quite happy with that now, and I'll just pop a new tail on that cable, which I had to remove in order to get that out of the thumb adjuster. Now the brakes are very prone to corroding in the frame, so I use a little bit of that copper grease there to stop that bonding, to stop the corrosion. That has an anti-corrosive element to that grease, so that will stop that corroding in the frame. And also important to lubricate your thumb adjusters on your brakes as you service them. That will help you when you're on the road and you just need to do a little tweak, or if you need to take a tire out and you want to release the thumb adjuster. That's all good practice there. Same with the front, a little bit of the copper grease where it meets the frame. Again, that will stop it bonding. You get a lot of dirt in these on the front. The front one is very prone to corroding, so we make sure that we solve that issue by that lubrication process. Again, thumb adjuster, a little bit of grease, doesn't have to be overdone, just a small amount to help that run up and down the threads as you're using it in the future. That will just help the bike operate and run correctly. So we're quite happy now. Chain set, group set, everything's back on, brakes are back on, pop the wheels back in, get everything to its final set position, pop on a new chain. This is a brand new chain on here, Shimano, and that goes on. It's got a little quick release that makes it quite easy to pop on and off, so cleaning it is also quite easy, but we've got a brand new chain there. Now I just checked through the gears, so I may do adjustments at this point, but in this instance it was all okay. So the rear cassette, the front chain rings, everything is working as it should be. The chain is operating up and down there nicely. Check the brakes, make sure that the brake pads are touching the rim at the same point of the brake actuation, left and right, maybe a little bit of adjustment there. And then before I start talking this bike through, a little detail here, the handlebar tape was moving, it had come loose and was moving down the handlebars there. Again, the customer hadn't asked me to do these. With the wheel work, it was already quite an expensive service, even though the actual servicing aspect was very, very entry level. The wheel work made it quite an expensive service, so we don't want to inflate the customer's bill in any way. So I'm just going to reset and refinish that handlebar tape so that he isn't holding onto the aluminium underneath it, and that will go until the next service before he can have his handlebar tape replaced. So now I'm going to torque up the bike. There was quite a lot loose on this bike. These are as they came in, they're loose, they need tightening up. The crown bolts, which I'm going to do next here, I do these in a diagonal motion. They were loose, so each one of those needed a little tweak. These steerer tube bolts were very loose. You can see there the torque wrench moving. You could quite easily have suddenly had to jolt the steering. The handlebars may have turned on the steerer tube. These were very, very loose. The pads within the caliper themselves, you can see that torque wrench moving there. Both sides were very, very loose. Again, that could be a problem waiting to happen. So this was a very timely service for things that were loose on this bike. Obviously these components we took off, so they had to be torqued. But look at this, look. Seat post, very loose. Could have had trouble with these seat posts dropping. So again, perfect for the service. Saddle was okay in this instance. Rear brake, these again weren't that tight. They were just marginally loose, not as bad as the front, but they still needed the torque wrench on them to get that torque absolutely perfect for those brake pads not to turn in the future. So we've run right through the bike now, front to back with the torque wrench. Everything's fine, but look at this bottle cage. Front bottle cage was completely loose on the frame, literally rattling around. The whole bike would have rattled when he was riding with that being as loose as it was. A couple of tweaks on there. The other one wasn't as loose, but certainly wasn't tight, so we tightened that one up as well. Now I'm happy with those. Just one other detail here, he'd actually got a wired computer on this bike. The tails were nipped off rather long. I like them to be absolutely tight and smooth to the fitting that they go into, so we just nip those off. That'll save him catching his hands if he's cleaning the bike or working on the bike or doing anything with the bike. Those little tails can be nemesisly sharp, so we want to just nip those off to their edges and make sure that that is absolutely nice. Final little detail. So you can see this bike is looking great. I do hope you've enjoyed this video. Please do subscribe. Please do like the video as well. It helps with the algorithms to get the video out there. We've got a big rebuild coming up, and I do hope you've enjoyed this video. You can see what huge difference we've made to this bike. So All that's left for me to do is thank you for watching if you've made it this far, and we'll see you again very, very soon. Bye for now.